My name is Natalie. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in rooms where decisions move millions of dollars, and silence often speaks louder than titles. I'm not the loudest voice in those rooms. I've never been. I don't interrupt. I don't posture. I don't sell myself with urgency. People usually read that as softness. They assume I'm supportive, not central. Reliable, not decisive. Someone who keeps things running, but not someone who changes outcomes. I've learned that when people underestimate you, they don't do it with cruelty. They do it casually, almost kindly, and that makes it harder to name. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or burning bridges. It's about something quieter, and, in my experience, far more common. It's about how power shifts when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop correcting the record, when you let people reveal exactly how they see you, and then you decide what to do with that information. A few years ago, I closed a $6.2 million deal. I led the strategy, managed the client relationship, handled the internal negotiations, and carried the weight of the outcome on my shoulders. The deal landed. The company celebrated. And then something strange happened. Finance split my commission across 4 people. My name vanished from the payout sheet overnight. No announcement, no confrontation, no dramatic meeting. Just a quiet adjustment in a spreadsheet that told me, very clearly, where I stood in the hierarchy of value. What hurt wasn't the money, not at first. It was the assumption behind the decision. The certainty that I wouldn't push back, that I would absorb it the way I always had. This story follows what happened before that moment and what unfolded after. Not in explosive scenes, but in small, precise shifts. In documents reviewed twice instead of once. In conversations that became shorter. In silence that stopped being passive and started becoming intentional. You'll hear about how I was perceived. How I learned to watch patterns instead of people. How preparation can be invisible when done right. And how the most irreversible decisions are often made without witnesses. I'm telling this now because I don't think these stories get told honestly. They're usually dressed up as triumphs or tragedies. This one is neither. It's about clarity, about restraint, about choosing not to fight loudly and still changing the outcome. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate anyone's flaws, including my own. I'll tell it the way it happened, from the inside, as someone who learned that dignity doesn't always announce itself. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, no pressure to answer out loud. Have you ever realized you were being underestimated, only after it had already been decided for you? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed my name most often, said with a nod, sometimes with a smile, almost always with finality. Dependable people don't need watching. They don't need credit. They don't need guarding. They're assumed to show up, absorb pressure, and keep things moving without friction. In meetings, I was the one who came prepared before anyone else realized preparation was necessary. I had the numbers, the timelines, the risks already mapped out. When questions came from leadership, they often came to me first. Not because I held the highest title, but because I had the clearest answers. Still, when decisions were summarized, my role was rarely named. I wasn't ignored, that's an important distinction. I was consulted constantly, my calendar was full, my inbox never slept, but visibility and value are not the same thing. I was present everywhere and anchored nowhere. People saw me as support, even when I was leading. They assumed I preferred it that way. I never corrected them. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't look like exclusion. It looks like trust without authority, like being looped in but not spoken about, like hearing your own ideas repeated back to the room by someone else with slightly different wording and watching heads nod as if something new had just been said. Early in my career, I told myself this was normal. I was younger than most of the executives I worked with. I didn't fit the usual profile. I was calm, where others were performative. I didn't rush to speak just to be seen. I believed, genuinely, that consistency would eventually speak for itself, and for a while it seemed like it did. My performance reviews were strong. Clients trusted me. Deals ran smoothly under my watch. When something went wrong, I was the one asked to stabilize it. When something went right, the success was described as a great team effort. That phrase became familiar, comforting even. until I noticed how selectively it was applied. I started to see the pattern not in moments of failure, but in moments of success. When results exceeded expectations, certain names were highlighted. When results simply met them, the credit dissolved into collective language. I learned where my work landed in that equation. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of that was temperament. I don't believe in forcing recognition. Another part was something more personal. I had grown up learning that being easy to work with was a kind of currency, that pushing too hard risked being labeled difficult. And once that label sticks, it's hard to remove. So I became exceptionally good at being indispensable without being threatening. I filled gaps before they were noticed. I smoothed conflicts before they escalated. I translated between departments that didn't understand each other's language. Over time, people stopped seeing the complexity of what I did. They only saw the absence of problems. That's a dangerous place to live professionally, because when your value is defined by what doesn't go wrong, it's easy for others to believe that things would be fine without you, or that your contribution is interchangeable. I remember one moment clearly. A senior colleague introduced me to an external partner as someone who helps keep everything organized. It wasn't meant to diminish me. He believed it. And in that belief was the clearest summary of how I was seen. Not as a driver, not as an owner, but as infrastructure. I smiled. I shook hands. I took notes. And I told myself again that this was temporary, that outcomes would eventually correct perception. What I didn't realize then was that perception, once settled, doesn't correct itself. It calcifies. It becomes the quiet justification for decisions made elsewhere, without you in the room. At the time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed. I was functioning inside a system that rewarded restraint, and I was very good at restraint. But invisibility doesn't announce itself as a problem. It waits. It accumulates. It shows up later, usually in a place you assumed was protected. Back then, I still believed that being essential was enough. I hadn't yet learned the difference between being needed and being acknowledged. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. Not because it was subtle in execution, but because it was wrapped in logic. Reasonable logic. The kind that leaves you feeling faintly unsettled, but without evidence strong enough to justify discomfort. It was a mid-quarter review meeting, one of those routine checkpoints where progress is discussed, numbers are adjusted, and everyone leaves believing alignment has been achieved. I had led the client negotiations for weeks, late nights, early mornings, a careful balancing of risk and trust. The strategy we were reviewing was mine, refined through iteration, pressure tested quietly before it ever reached the room. As the conversation moved along, a senior director began outlining the approach. He spoke confidently, fluently. He used my structure, my phrasing, my risk framework. He didn't say my name. At first, I assumed he would circle back, that this was just how meetings flowed. I waited. I watched the room respond, approval, interest, momentum building. When questions came, they were directed at him. He answered easily, occasionally glancing in my direction, as if checking for confirmation. I nodded once, twice. That was it. When the meeting ended, people thanked him for the clarity. Someone said the plan felt well thought out. I gathered my notes, closed my laptop, and reminded myself that credit is rarely linear, that this didn't matter, that the work was still moving forward. That was the rationalization. The cut itself came later, in a follow-up email, a summary sent to leadership, the strategy outlined cleanly, ownership attributed broadly. My name absent again, but this time intentionally so. I could tell. The language had been adjusted, the tone smoothed. What had been a singular point of accountability was now a shared effort. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't rage I felt. It was confusion. Not about what had happened, but about whether I was expected to notice. The omission wasn't aggressive. It was neat, professional, defensible. If I said something, I would sound territorial. If I stayed quiet, I would confirm what they already believed, that I didn't mind. So I did nothing. I told myself this was a one-off, a function of hierarchy, a reminder that visibility often follows title, not contribution. I adjusted my expectations and moved on, but something shifted internally. I began paying closer attention, not to people's words, but to patterns. Who spoke when results were uncertain? Who summarized when success was assured? Who absorbed risk and who absorbed credit? Once you start watching that, you can't stop. Small moments began to stand out. A deck presented without my input noted. A client call scheduled without me, even though I had built the relationship. Decisions made downstream of my work, with just enough distance to keep me out of the narrative. Each instance, on its own, was insignificant. Together they formed a quiet outline of my role. Still, I didn't confront anyone. There's a belief that speaking up early prevents escalation. In some environments, that's true. In others, it only clarifies where you stand, and I wasn't ready to see that yet. Instead, I focused on execution, on being precise, on making myself undeniably useful. I thought excellence would correct the drift. What I didn't understand then was that once your contribution is reframed as support, additional excellence only deepens the frame. You become better infrastructure, not a clearer leader. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar. But it marked the moment when my internal narrative began to diverge from the external one. Outwardly, I was still trusted, still praised, still included. Inwardly, I was learning something I hadn't wanted to know. That respect can erode quietly, without conflict, and without anyone feeling they've done something wrong. I remember walking home that evening, replaying the meeting in my head, not to relive it, but to catalog it. I didn't yet know why I was doing that. Only that something told me this moment would matter later. At the time, I believed silence was maturity. I didn't yet realize it was also a signal. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. That was the problem. Work continued, deadlines were met, results were delivered, no one treated me poorly. In fact, if you asked anyone, they would have said they respected me deeply. And in a way, they did. Just not in the way that protects you when power starts to redistribute. What changed was the frequency. Moments like the one in that meeting didn't repeat exactly, but variations of them appeared often enough to feel familiar. A recommendation of mine would be presented as a group conclusion. A decision I'd driven would be announced by someone else. I was always nearby. Always present, rarely named. At first, I kept explaining it away. They're under pressure. They didn't mean to exclude me. It's not personal. And those explanations were probably true. That's what made them dangerous. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as convenience. I noticed how often I was asked to take care of it without being included in the follow-up discussion. How frequently my role ended at execution, even when I had shaped the direction. I became the person others leaned on to deliver, not the person they deferred to when deciding. When I did speak up, it was measured. I clarified facts. I corrected small misattributions lightly, with a smile. Never enough to create discomfort, never enough to change the dynamic. There's a cost to that kind of restraint. Every time you minimize your own contribution to keep the peace, you teach people how to treat you. You show them what you'll tolerate. And over time, tolerance becomes expectation. I told myself I was being strategic, that staying composed preserved my reputation, that patience would eventually be rewarded. I had seen other people burn themselves out fighting for credit. I didn't want that. So I normalized what was happening. I accepted phrases like, "We all worked on this," even when I hadn't seen others in weeks. I nodded when leadership thanked the team for initiatives I had run end to end. I learned to detach my ego from outcomes. The problem was the system didn't detach. It kept track. It updated its understanding of where I fit, and it adjusted accordingly. I began to feel it in subtler ways. Invitations changed. I was looped in later. Decisions were framed as already made. My input was requested after alignment, not before. I was becoming operational, not strategic. That realization should have stopped me. Instead, I doubled down on reliability. I worked harder. I anticipated needs earlier. I became even more efficient. I believed that if I removed every possible point of friction, my value would be undeniable. What I didn't see was that I was making myself easier to overlook. There's a strange psychology at play in organizations. The people who cause noise are noticed. The people who solve problems silently are assumed to exist for that purpose. Their presence becomes part of the background. I remember a colleague once saying, "Natalie will handle it. She always does." It was meant as praise. It landed like a warning. By then, the pattern was clear enough that I started tracking it mentally, not obsessively, just enough to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. I noticed who signed off on work, who was copied on emails, who spoke first when success was discussed. I also noticed my own behavior. I was shrinking my language, using we when I was accurate, softening statements that could stand firmly on their own. I was managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity, and yet I stayed, because leaving felt premature, because nothing had been taken from me yet, because the cost of confrontation seemed higher than the cost of endurance. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through a single act, but through repetition that never quite crosses the line, through silence that feels reasonable in the moment and heavy in retrospect. I wasn't being mistreated, I was being repositioned, and I was cooperating, because cooperation had always worked before. I didn't know then that systems don't correct for fairness, they correct for behavior. And my behavior was telling them exactly how much they could take. By the time I sensed something was wrong, it already felt familiar, comfortable, even. That was the most alarming part. Disrespect had stopped feeling like a deviation. It had become the baseline. There's a moment when understanding clicks into place, not loudly, but with a quiet sense of inevitability. For me, it wasn't triggered by a confrontation or a betrayal. It happened during an onboarding meeting for a new hire. I was asked to join to help them get up to speed. That phrase again. Help. Not lead, not own, just help. As I walked the new manager through our processes, I listened to how my role was described. I was introduced as someone who knew the history, who could fill in gaps, who was great at execution. No mention of strategy. No acknowledgement that many of the systems being explained existed because I had designed them. I realized then that my role had been decided without me, not formally. There was no document that said Natalie is invisible now, but everyone was operating from the same script. I was the reliable constant, the person who made things work behind the scenes, the one you leaned on, not the one you elevated. Once you see that, it's impossible to unsee. I thought back over the past year and replayed interactions through this new lens. The times I'd been left out of high-level discussions. The way my input was sought privately, but not credited publicly. The ease with which others stepped into ownership of outcomes I had driven. I wasn't being edged out, I was being contained. The role assigned to me was comfortable for everyone else. It allowed them to benefit from my competence without having to share authority. It required no confrontation, no explanation. It relied on my cooperation, and I had been cooperating. I also saw how I had been complicit in shaping this role. My silence, my patience, my refusal to self-advocate because I believed the work should speak for itself. In doing so, I had allowed others to speak for me. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because anger clouds judgment, precision sharpens it. I began to understand that I wasn't underestimated because I lacked capability. I was underestimated because I lacked visibility by design, both theirs and mine. The system rewarded those who claimed space. I had been focused on maintaining harmony. Harmony, I learned, is often another word for hierarchy preserved. I didn't decide to change anything that day. There was no internal vow, no dramatic shift in posture. I simply stopped assuming the situation would resolve itself. Instead, I asked a different question. What does this role cost me if I stay inside it? The answer wasn't immediate, but it was forming. I saw how being useful limited my leverage, how being dependable made me predictable, how being easy to work with made it easy to take me for granted. And I saw something else, something more unsettling. If this role was now my identity in the organization, then any value I created could be reassigned without friction. Because infrastructure doesn't own outcomes, people do. That's when I realized how fragile my position actually was. Not because I lacked skill, but because I lacked recognition. And recognition is what anchors contribution in systems that run on perception. I started paying attention to how others protected themselves, how they documented ownership, how they framed narratives early, how they positioned themselves before results landed. None of it was loud. None of it was unethical. It was just intentional. I hadn't been. By the time that onboarding meeting ended, I knew the role I had been assigned. Not by title, but by function. I was the one who made things work, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. And I understood finally that if I stayed in that role, I would eventually be asked to absorb a loss that someone else would benefit from. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew enough to stop assuming loyalty flowed both ways. The realization didn't demand action. It demanded awareness. The day something shifted didn't announce itself as important. There was no argument, no raised voice, no email that made my stomach drop. It was an ordinary day, shaped like every other. Calendar blocks, status updates, quiet momentum. If you were watching from the outside, you would have seen nothing unusual. Internally, everything changed. It happened during a routine review of a deal in progress. Not the $6.2 million one. Not yet. This was smaller, but structurally similar. I had been brought in early to shape the framework, manage the risk profile, and prepare the client-facing narrative. I did what I always did. Built it carefully, documented assumptions, aligned stakeholders, quietly before anyone felt exposed. During the internal discussion, someone asked a question that revealed a misunderstanding, subtle but meaningful. The answer was in the documentation I had circulated days earlier. I knew exactly where it was. I could have answered immediately. Instead, I paused. Not long. Just long enough to notice what happened next. Someone else jumped in, gave a partial answer. Another added context. The response grew messy, imprecise. Leadership nodded anyway. The conversation moved on with a decision that wasn't wrong, but wasn't optimal. Normally, I would have corrected it. Cleanly, efficiently, I would have protected the outcome without drawing attention to myself. That day I didn't. Not out of spite, not as a test. Simply because for the first time I felt no obligation to rescue the process from its own assumptions. And in that pause I felt something unfamiliar. Distance. I watched the system operate without my intervention and realized how much invisible labor I had been contributing to make it appear smooth. How often I had filled gaps that others didn't even know existed. The decision made that day cost nothing in the short term, but it revealed something crucial to me. They didn't notice my absence. Not immediately, not consciously. The meeting ended on time. People moved on. No one followed up asking for clarification. No one circled back to check my notes. And that's when I understood. My value wasn't being measured by what I added. It was being measured by what I prevented. That realization landed quietly, but it stayed. Later that afternoon, I reviewed my own behavior over the past months. How often I had stepped in automatically. How rarely I had asked whether my involvement was requested or simply assumed. I wasn't angry at anyone. I was curious. What would happen if I stopped compensating for other people's blind spots? What would surface if I allowed small imperfections to exist? Imperfections that were not my responsibility to correct. This wasn't about sabotage. I still did my job. I met my obligations. I delivered what I was accountable for. What changed was what I no longer volunteered. The shift was internal, not visible. I stopped narrating my thinking out loud. I stopped filling silence. I stopped translating between departments unless asked. And in doing so, I created space not for chaos but for clarity. I began to see where decisions truly originated. Who held authority versus who held knowledge. Who was comfortable being wrong, and who relied on others to make them look right. That day didn't make me strategic overnight. It made me observant in a different way. Less invested in being useful, more interested in being accurate. I realized that silence could be diagnostic. That withholding commentary revealed more than offering it ever had. For years, my quiet had been reactive, an instinct to maintain harmony. Now it became deliberate, chosen, and with that choice came a subtle but important boundary. I was no longer responsible for outcomes I didn't own. Nothing exploded. No one called me out. No feedback changed. From the outside, I was the same Natalie, but internally, the narrative had shifted from, how do I help this work, to what is actually mine to carry. That question would change everything that followed. At the time, I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew that something irreversible had begun. Not in the organization, but in me. The system hadn't noticed yet, but I had. Once silence becomes intentional, it feels different in your body. Before, my quiet had been a reflex, an instinct shaped by years of believing that restraint equaled professionalism. Now it was a decision I made moment by moment, and that decision came with awareness. I still spoke when it mattered. I still delivered what I was responsible for. But I no longer rushed to fill gaps that weren't assigned to me. I let questions linger. I let assumptions stand long enough to be seen for what they were. What surprised me was how quickly that silence was misread. People didn't interpret it as discernment. They interpreted it as compliance. Meetings became more one-directional. I was informed, not consulted. Updates were delivered to me instead of built with me. When I did speak, the room often reacted with mild surprise, as if my voice had become optional, decorative. No one asked why I had pulled back. They simply adjusted. That told me everything. If my silence had triggered concern, someone would have checked in. If my absence had disrupted outcomes, it would have been noticed. Instead, my reduced presence was absorbed easily, because the system had already categorized me as non-essential to decision-making. I took note. This is the part most people misunderstand about power. They think it's about visibility or dominance. Often, it's about who is allowed to disengage without consequence and who isn't. I was allowed, because I had been positioned as support, not ownership. So I watched. I watched how often others spoke without preparation, how frequently decisions were made with incomplete information, how confidence filled the space where clarity should have been. And I noticed something else. My silence created room for others to overextend. People began to claim things they didn't fully understand. They summarized work they hadn't done. They answered questions they weren't equipped to answer, not maliciously, just comfortably, because no one was correcting them anymore. And still, I didn't step in. Not because I wanted them to fail, but because I wanted to see the system without my invisible scaffolding. I needed to understand whether my presence had been essential or merely convenient. The results were subtle but cumulative. Follow-ups increased. Clarifications were needed. Timelines slipped by inches, not miles. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough friction to reveal where competence actually lived. And yet, the narrative didn't change. Leadership didn't look toward me and say, "We need you back in this." They adjusted around the friction, added meetings, added layers, compensated structurally instead of recognizing the source. That told me something else. They would rather build complexity than redistribute credit. I stopped taking this personally. Instead, I treated it like data. Silence, I learned, is a mirror. It reflects how much people actually value your contribution versus how much they rely on your labor. And in that reflection, I saw clearly where I stood. What made this phase difficult wasn't fear. It was discipline. Resisting the urge to fix things is harder than fixing them. Letting inefficiency exist when you know how to remove it takes restraint. But restraint was no longer about being agreeable. It was about accuracy. I began documenting more deliberately, not outcomes, but inputs. What I was asked to do, what I wasn't, where decisions were made, who was present, who wasn't. Not to build a case, just to understand the terrain. People often think silence is passive. In reality, chosen silence is active observation. It sharpens your perception. It reveals patterns that noise hides. And what I was seeing now was a system that assumed my availability, but not my authority. That relied on my competence, but not my consent. That combination is unstable. At the time, no one else felt it. They still saw me as steady, unemotional, safe. They mistook my quiet for acceptance. In truth, it was alignment, with myself for the first time in a long while. I wasn't planning anything yet. I wasn't strategizing an exit or a confrontation. I was simply no longer cushioning outcomes for people who didn't see me as part of them. That shift didn't make me powerful. It made me clear. And clarity, once gained, doesn't go away. What they never noticed was not my silence. It was what I was doing with it. From the outside, my behavior looked unchanged. I showed up. I delivered what was asked. I remained calm, responsive, professional. If anything, I appeared less stressed than before, lighter, more contained. That's because I had stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine. What filled that space wasn't resentment. It was attention. I began paying closer attention to how things actually worked beneath the surface, not how they were described in meetings, but how they moved in practice. I noticed where information originated, how it traveled, and where it quietly stopped. I noticed who relied on informal channels and who documented everything. I noticed which decisions were reversible and which ones weren't. And slowly, without announcing it, I began preparing. Not for revenge, for understanding. I revisited old deals, not to relive them, but to trace patterns. Who initiated contact? Who negotiated terms? Who approved changes? Who signed? Who was named? Who wasn't? I looked at timelines the way an auditor would, not the way a participant does. What emerged wasn't chaos, it was consistency. I saw how often my involvement had been critical early, invisible later. How frequently my work served as the foundation for decisions that bore other people's names. How easily contribution blurred once outcomes were secured. I also saw something more concrete. I had documentation. Not just emails or decks, but detailed records of negotiation steps, internal approvals, red lines, margin trade-offs, materials I had kept simply because I was thorough, because I believed clarity protected everyone. I hadn't realized how asymmetric that clarity was. Most people didn't keep records like this. They relied on memory, on verbal alignment, on shared understanding that was never fully shared. I started organizing what I already had, quietly, not in a folder labeled evidence, just in a way that made relationships visible. Cause and effect, action and outcome, responsibility and result. This wasn't about building leverage yet. It was about knowing whether leverage existed. At the same time, I began observing how finance interacted with deals, what they prioritized, what they questioned, how they interpreted ownership. I noticed how often payout structures were treated as administrative rather than moral decisions. Numbers, I learned, have a way of laundering assumptions. If a name isn't attached early, it rarely appears later. I also noticed how comfortable others were letting me handle complexity without visibility. They didn't fear my knowledge because they didn't believe I would use it. They trusted my discretion because I had always exercised it in their favor. That trust created blind spots. No one asked what I was tracking. No one wondered why I was quieter. No one suspected that my withdrawal wasn't disengagement. It was recalibration. I didn't correct misstatements anymore. I let them exist in the record. I didn't chase alignment. I let misalignment surface on its own. And I learned something critical during this time. Systems don't reward truth. They reward narratives that arrive on time. I had been delivering truth too early, too cleanly, too quietly. Others were delivering narratives later, louder, and with more confidence. So I stopped competing on those terms. Instead, I positioned myself where timing mattered. I made sure my contributions were traceable. Not performative, traceable. I clarified scope in writing. I confirmed ownership in follow-ups. I asked precise questions that required equally precise answers. None of this raised alarms. It looked like diligence, like maturity, like someone who cared about process, which was true, but it was also positioning. I wasn't trying to be seen yet. I was trying to be undeniable later. What they never noticed was that I had stopped optimizing for harmony and started optimizing for accuracy. That I was no longer smoothing edges that protected other people's narratives at the expense of my own. They assumed I was still playing the same role. They didn't see that I had stepped out of it internally. By the time the $6.2 million deal entered the picture, I already understood the terrain. I knew where decisions were made, where value was assigned, and where accountability dissolved. I wasn't surprised by what happened next, but I was ready for it, and that made all the difference. The private reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time the $6.2 million deal closed, I had already traced its anatomy from first contact to final signature. I knew exactly where it had started, how it had been shaped, and which risks had nearly derailed it. I knew which concessions had preserved margin and which moments of restraint had protected trust. I also knew, with uncomfortable clarity, how easily my role could be reframed once the outcome was secure. Still, I let the process unfold as it always had. The deal was celebrated internally. Leadership circulated a brief note, measured, congratulatory, carefully worded. The client was satisfied. The numbers looked good. There was no reason to suspect anything had gone wrong, until I opened the payout sheet. It wasn't sent to me directly. It never was. I accessed it the same way I always had, through the system, quietly, without expectation. At first, I thought there had been a formatting error, a filter applied incorrectly. I refreshed the page. Then I read it again. The commission had been split across 4 names. Mine wasn't one of them. There was no blank space where my name should have been. No placeholder, just absence. Clean, intentional, as if I had never been part of the deal at all. I didn't react immediately. That surprised me. I didn't feel anger or panic or disbelief. I felt something closer to stillness, a kind of internal quiet that only comes when a question you've been carrying finally answers itself. This was the reveal, not of malice, but of structure. Finance hadn't acted independently. They rarely do. This wasn't a clerical error or a misunderstanding. It was the logical conclusion of a narrative that had been forming for a long time, one in which my contribution was foundational but unclaimed. In that narrative, redistributing value didn't feel unethical. It felt administrative. I closed the sheet and sat with it. I didn't email anyone. I didn't screenshot it. I didn't forward it to myself with a note of disbelief. I simply opened my notebook, the same one I'd been carrying for years, and began cross-referencing. Timelines, emails, approvals, red lines, internal messages, notes from calls that had never been formalized elsewhere. I wasn't looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I was looking for alignment between reality and record. What I found was consistency. Every critical inflection point bore my involvement. Every major risk decision had passed through me. Every strategic shift had been initiated or validated by my analysis. And yet, when ownership had been summarized at the end, my role had evaporated. Not because it was unclear, because it was inconvenient. I realized then that this wasn't about the money. It was about whether the system acknowledged me as someone who owned outcomes or merely enabled them. And that distinction had consequences far beyond a single payout. If I let this stand, it would become precedent. Not formally, but culturally. It would confirm that my contributions could be absorbed without recognition, without negotiation, without resistance. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't need to. The reveal wasn't the payout sheet itself. It was the clarity it gave me about where I stood and what options were actually available to me. I saw very clearly that I had leverage. Not emotional leverage, structural leverage. I had knowledge that predated narratives, documentation that predated summaries, context that couldn't be reconstructed after the fact. And I had it not because I was suspicious, but because I was meticulous. I also saw that no one was watching me closely. No one expected a reaction. No one anticipated resistance. The omission had been made with confidence, not arrogance, but certainty. They were certain I would stay quiet. That certainty was the reveal. I closed my notebook, locked my screen, and went back to work. I responded to emails. I joined a call. I spoke when spoken to. Nothing changed externally. Internally, everything had resolved. I no longer wondered if I was imagining things. I no longer debated whether patience would pay off. I no longer questioned whether the system would correct itself. It wouldn't, and now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Not people, a pattern. And patterns, once understood, can be navigated, without noise, without drama, and without asking for permission. There's a moment after clarity arrives where nothing happens. No action, no resolve, just space. That's where I was. I didn't rush to decide anything after seeing the payout sheet. I didn't tell myself a story about betrayal or injustice. I didn't even frame it as a problem to be solved. I treated it as a fact, one that required accuracy, not emotion. I gave myself time to see all the options. There were several. I could confront finance directly, ask for an explanation, force a correction. That path was available to me, and it would likely have worked in some form. But it would have required me to prove my worth inside a narrative I hadn't authored. It would have framed the issue as a misunderstanding, not a pattern. I could escalate to leadership, present the documentation, make the case, reclaim my name on the sheet. That option carried more weight, but also more cost. It would have changed how I was seen immediately, not as strategic, but as disruptive, not as principled, but as difficult. I could also do nothing, absorb the loss, file it away as confirmation of what I already knew, preserve my standing by sacrificing my claim. That was the path of least resistance, the one most aligned with how I had always behaved. For a few days I sat with all three. What made this a true decision point wasn't the money, it was the identity question beneath it. Who was I willing to be after this? If I confronted them, I would still be operating inside their framework, asking to be recognized by a system that had already shown me how it worked. If I stayed silent, I would be consenting to a version of myself that I no longer recognized. There was a fourth option. It was quieter, slower, and irreversible. I could stop participating in narratives that didn't include me and reposition myself where ownership was explicit, not implied. I could withdraw my labor from spaces where it was assumed rather than acknowledged. I could choose alignment over acceptance. That option didn't involve arguments or explanations. It didn't require anyone to agree with me. It simply required consistency. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about deciding whether I would continue building futures for other people to claim. I thought about how long it had taken to arrive at this point. How many small moments had led here. How much energy I had spent managing perception instead of shaping reality. And I understood something important. Any action I took that tried to correct this outcome would still center the system that produced it. The irreversible option was different. It meant changing where and how I invested my expertise. It meant being precise about what I owned and letting go of everything else. It meant accepting short-term discomfort for long-term coherence. It also meant walking away from the idea that fairness would be granted if I waited long enough. That was the hardest part, not because it hurt, but because it ended a hope I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I didn't make the decision in a dramatic moment. There was no internal speech, no declaration. I simply stopped considering the other options. Once that happened, the path forward became clear. Not easy, but clear. I didn't need to announce anything. I didn't need to reclaim the commission publicly. I didn't need validation. What I needed was to move in a way that made this outcome impossible to repeat. And that required a level of silence most people mistake for passivity. The decision point wasn't when I chose to act. It was when I chose not to explain. Once the decision was made, everything became very simple. Not easy, but simple. I didn't announce a change. I didn't update my role description or request new authority. I didn't confront anyone about the payout sheet. From the outside, nothing suggested a shift. I was still calm, still responsive, still professional, but I moved differently. The first thing I changed was scope. I stopped accepting ambiguity as a default. When I was asked to support an initiative, I asked, politely, precisely, what ownership looked like. When I was brought into conversations late, I documented that timing without commentary. When deliverables were discussed, I confirmed in writing what I was accountable for and what I wasn't. This didn't raise alarms. It sounded like process hygiene, like someone being careful, which was true. The second thing I changed was access. I stopped volunteering context unless it was explicitly requested. I answered questions fully, but only the questions asked. I no longer preempted misunderstandings. If someone wanted my strategic thinking, they had to invite it. They rarely did, and that was informative. The third shift was more subtle. I began redirecting my deepest effort toward areas where ownership was clear and recognition was built into the structure. Smaller projects, tighter mandates, clear accountability, places where contribution couldn't dissolve into team effort because the system itself required attribution. I didn't announce this reallocation of energy, I just did it. People assumed I was busy. They were right. What they didn't see was that I had stopped cushioning outcomes that benefited others disproportionately. I delivered excellence where it was reciprocated and adequacy where it wasn't. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. I also began speaking with external partners more deliberately, not to undermine anyone, but to establish continuity, to make sure my role was visible where it mattered most, outside the internal echo chamber. Externally, my value had never been questioned. Internally, it had been redistributed. That contrast mattered. At the same time, I quietly consulted with a legal advisor, not to pursue action, but to understand boundaries. What constituted ownership? What documentation mattered? What protections existed if patterns continued? Knowledge doesn't demand use to be powerful. Sometimes it only needs to exist. I noticed that as I moved this way, contained, deliberate, unreactive, others filled the silence with assumptions. They believed I had accepted the payout outcome, that I had moved on, that my quiet signaled closure. It didn't. It signaled detachment. And detachment is dangerous to systems that rely on compliance. Nothing collapsed. No one panicked. But small things began to surface. Questions that used to be answered effortlessly now required meetings. Decisions slowed. Dependencies became visible. Still, no one connected it to me, because I wasn't loud, because I wasn't complaining, because I was still easy to work with. That was the irony. Moving in silence allowed me to change the shape of my involvement without triggering resistance. I wasn't opposing anyone. I was simply no longer over-functioning on their behalf. This phase required discipline. There were moments I wanted to explain myself, to clarify why I was stepping back, to be understood, but I resisted that urge. Explanation would have invited negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. I was repositioning. By the time people began to feel the consequences, the source was no longer traceable to a single decision or person. It was systemic, diffuse, hard to challenge. Exactly the way my contributions had once been. I hadn't forced anything. I had just stopped compensating, and that quietly began to change everything. The consequences didn't arrive with impact. They arrived with confusion. At first, it showed up as friction no one could quite name. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups multiplied. People began circling the same issues without resolution. The work still moved, but it no longer glided. I noticed before anyone else did, because I knew exactly what had changed. I was no longer absorbing the complexity. Where I once anticipated objections, they now surfaced late. Where I once aligned stakeholders quietly, disagreements now appeared in public threads. Where I once translated intent into execution, intent now stalled, waiting for clarification that never came. No one blamed me. That was the interesting part. Instead, people blamed timing, bandwidth, market conditions. Each explanation was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a fog that made accountability difficult. I stayed calm inside it. When questions came to me, I answered them. Precisely. Without embellishment. Without stepping beyond what I had been asked to own. I didn't volunteer fixes. I didn't bridge gaps. I let the system feel its own weight. Slowly, others began to feel something else. Absence. Not my absence as a person. I was still there. But the absence of ease. The absence of cohesion. The absence of someone quietly making sure things landed the right way. And because that absence had never been acknowledged before, it was hard to name now. I heard it in offhand comments. Why is this suddenly so complicated? We used to move faster. This feels messier than it should be. No one said my name. That told me everything. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were cumulative. Each small inefficiency added pressure. Each misalignment required more meetings. Each unresolved question demanded attention from people who assumed they shouldn't have to give it. Leadership began stepping in more frequently, not to solve problems, but to manage perception, to reassure, to contain. I watched this with distance, not satisfaction, not resentment, recognition. This was the cost of redistributing credit without redistributing capability. You can remove a name from a payout sheet. You can reframe ownership after the fact. But you can't erase the labor that made outcomes smooth in the first place. When that labor withdraws, the system compensates, often inefficiently. I noticed how quickly others became defensive, how easily conversation shifted toward justification instead of resolution, how people spoke more and said less. Confidence filled the gaps where clarity used to live. Still, no one confronted me, because nothing I was doing violated expectation. I was meeting every obligation assigned to me. I was responding on time. I was professional. The problem wasn't my behavior. It was the absence of what I used to give freely. That absence made some people uneasy. I could feel it in the way they looped me into emails without clear asks, in the way they sought my input after decisions had already been made, hoping for validation rather than direction. I didn't provide it. I provided accuracy. And accuracy, when it arrives too late, can feel like resistance. By then, the narrative had shifted again, but not in my favor. Now I was seen as someone who was less engaged, more reserved, harder to read. No one asked why. They simply adjusted the story to fit the outcome. I accepted that, because stories change faster than structures, and I was no longer investing in either. What mattered was that the consequences were now distributed. The friction wasn't mine to manage. The confusion wasn't mine to resolve. And that redistribution was already irreversible. Once people experience the cost of an assumption, they rarely return to it willingly. They may not articulate it. They may not connect it to the source, but they feel it, and feeling changes behavior. By the time leadership began asking broader questions about process, about alignment, about efficiency, the answer was already embedded in the system. It just hadn't been spoken yet. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, they were already asking the wrong questions. The focus wasn't on what had changed, but on why things felt harder. Leadership convened meetings about efficiency, about communication, about cross-functional clarity. New processes were proposed, templates circulated, checkpoints added. None of it addressed the source, because the source wasn't procedural. It was relational. I could feel the shift in tone before it was named. Conversations became more cautious. People began over-explaining themselves. Decisions were delayed in favor of consensus building that went nowhere. And still, no one spoke to me directly. That silence was telling. If they had believed I was the problem, they would have confronted me. If they had believed I was essential, they would have pulled me closer. Instead, they hovered in between, uncertain, uncomfortable, hoping the issue would resolve itself. It didn't. At some point, someone in finance noticed a discrepancy, not in numbers, but in expectations. Deals were closing, but the downstream coordination wasn't clean. Attribution was becoming messy. Questions about ownership surfaced too late to answer cleanly. I wasn't included in those conversations. Not yet. When my name finally came up, it was cautiously, tentatively, framed as curiosity rather than accountability. Has Natalie been looped into this? Do we know what she thinks? Those questions came after decisions, not before, which meant it was already too late. I could sense the discomfort building, the realization that something intangible had been lost, but not knowing how to retrieve it. People began reaching out to me more often, but without clarity. Casual check-ins, open-ended pings. I responded politely, briefly, professionally. I didn't reinsert myself, because reinsertion would have required me to resume the role I had stepped out of, and that role was no longer available to me, not without cost. At one point, a senior leader asked to sync, no agenda, just a quick catch-up. I agreed. The conversation was careful. He asked how I was feeling, whether I was still enjoying the work, whether anything had changed. I answered honestly, but not expansively. I said I was focused, that I was clear on my responsibilities, that I was delivering what I was accountable for. All true. He nodded, paused, said nothing more. He didn't ask about the payout. He didn't ask about the deal. He didn't ask about ownership, because asking would have required acknowledging that something had been mishandled, and that acknowledgement would have unraveled more than anyone wanted to face. Organizations are very good at sensing when a correction will cost more than it saves, when reversing a decision would expose a pattern instead of resolving an issue. By the time that realization sets in, the window for repair has closed. I saw that clearly then. This wasn't going to be fixed with a meeting or an apology or a revised spreadsheet. Too many assumptions had already been validated by inaction. Too many narratives had settled. Even if someone had offered to correct the payout at that point, it wouldn't have mattered. Not because of the money, but because of the timing. Recognition that arrives only after friction feels like mitigation, not respect. And mitigation doesn't restore trust. I wasn't angry. I was done. Not with the company, not with the people. With the role. The system could feel it. That's why the outreach increased. That's why the questions circled. That's why the energy shifted. But no one named it. And because no one named it, nothing could be reversed. I didn't need to say no. I had already said enough by not stepping back in. At that point, the path forward was no longer up for debate. It had narrowed, quietly, to the only option that preserved my coherence. They hadn't lost me. They had lost access. And access, once withdrawn, doesn't return without a fundamental change. That change wasn't coming. So I prepared for this final conversation, not to demand anything, but to close a chapter with clarity. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. No dramatic timing, no symbolic date, just a calendar invite with a clear agenda and a neutral subject line. I chose that on purpose. I didn't want the meeting to carry emotional weight before it even began. When I joined the room, everyone was polite, attentive, slightly guarded. They expected tension. They didn't get it. I didn't open with the payout. I didn't open with the deal. I opened with scope. I said calmly that I wanted to align on how ownership was defined in our work, that I wanted to make sure my responsibilities matched how outcomes were being attributed. That clarity mattered to me more than correction. No accusations, no timelines, no raised eyebrows, just facts. I watched their posture shift, not defensively, carefully. This wasn't a fight they had prepared for. It wasn't even one they were sure they were in. Someone mentioned the deal, casually, as if it were one data point among many. I acknowledged it, briefly. I said I had noticed my name wasn't included in the payout structure. I didn't say it was wrong. I didn't say it was unfair. I said it was informative. That word landed. Informative implies learning, observation, not grievance. I explained without emotion that I had led the strategy, managed the client, negotiated the terms, and carried the risk. I said I had documentation if there were questions, but I didn't offer to share it. I didn't need to. Silence followed, not awkward silence, processing silence. One person began to speak, then stopped. Another nodded slowly. Someone else shifted in their chair. No one denied what I said. That mattered. I continued. I said that what concerned me wasn't the commission itself. It was the misalignment between contribution and ownership. That I couldn't continue operating in a system where my work was foundational, but my role was optional. I said this evenly, without heat, without ultimatum. Then I said the most important sentence of the meeting. I've adjusted how I engage accordingly. That was it. No threat, no demand, just a statement of reality. They asked what I meant. I explained that I was now working only within clearly defined ownership, that I was focusing my energy where accountability was explicit, that I wasn't available for roles that required me to carry outcomes without recognition. I didn't say any more. I didn't need to. There were a few attempts to soften the moment, to frame what had happened as a misunderstanding, to suggest retroactive fixes, future alignment. I listened, I nodded, I thanked them, and I declined, politely. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, because I understood timing. I said that retroactive recognition wouldn't change the underlying structure. That future alignment would require a different role definition than the one I currently held, and that I was at peace with my decision. That's when the energy shifted, not to anger, to resignation. They realized I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't seeking validation. I wasn't asking to be seen. I had already seen everything I needed to. The meeting ended cleanly. No raised voices, no damaged dignity. We shook hands. We agreed to transition responsibilities thoughtfully. When I left the room, I felt light. Not triumphant, not relieved. Complete. Confrontation doesn't require force. Sometimes it only requires clarity, delivered without apology. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't embarrassed anyone. I hadn't even named blame. I had simply made my participation conditional on alignment, and that condition had been unmet for too long. After the conversation, life didn't transform overnight. There was no cinematic exit, no sudden applause, no moment where everyone realized what they had lost and rushed to correct it. That's not how these stories usually end. Instead, things became quieter. My days changed shape. Fewer reactive meetings, more deliberate work, less noise, more intention. I transitioned responsibilities cleanly, without bitterness. I documented what needed to be handed over and stepped back without commentary. People were polite, some were warmer than before. Others became distant. That was fine. I wasn't measuring connection anymore. I was measuring coherence. Who I am now is not defined by what I walked away from, but by what I no longer tolerate. I don't confuse being needed with being respected. I don't accept vague appreciation in place of clear ownership, and I don't lend my competence to systems that treat it as communal property. That doesn't make me hardened. It makes me precise. I still value collaboration. I still care about outcomes. I still work quietly. But my quiet is no longer a default. It's a boundary. Chosen. Maintained. I no longer rush to prove myself. I let structure do that work. If my role isn't explicit, my involvement is limited. If my contribution isn't visible, my energy isn't either. This shift didn't come from anger. It came from self-respect. I've learned that dignity isn't something you demand. It's something you design your life around. You build it into your agreements, your timelines, your scope. I also learned that being underestimated is only dangerous if you internalize it, if you accept it as truth instead of information. I didn't. I used it. The people who once assumed I would always be there, absorbing, smoothing, stabilizing, now experience the world without that buffer. Not because I wanted them to struggle, but because it's not my job to protect systems that don't protect me. That realization didn't make me smaller. It made me clear. Today, when I enter a room, I don't wonder how I'm perceived. I focus on whether the structure makes sense, whether ownership is clean, whether accountability flows both ways. If it does, I engage fully. If it doesn't, I decline calmly. No explanation, no resentment, just alignment. I've also noticed something unexpected. When you stop explaining yourself, people either step up or step away. Both outcomes are useful. The ones who step up do so with respect. The ones who step away were never aligned to begin with. Either way, you gain space. I don't carry bitterness from what happened. I carry clarity. and clarity is lighter than anger, easier to maintain, harder to shake. This chapter didn't end with a win or a loss. It ended with definition. I know who I am now. Not invisible, not overextended, not quietly hoping to be seen. I am deliberate, I am bounded, and I am no longer available for roles that require me to disappear. That for me is enough. When I look back on this story now, what stays with me isn't the deal or the money or even the moment my name vanished from the payout sheet. What stays with me is how long I mistook endurance for integrity. I believed that staying calm, staying quiet, staying useful was proof of character. And in many ways, it was. But character, I learned, is not the same thing as protection. You can be principled and still be misplaced. You can be loyal and still be leveraged. You can be essential and still be erased. None of that requires malice. That's the part people struggle with. No one in this story woke up intending to harm me. There were no villains, no secret meetings plotting my exclusion. What happened was simpler and more common. A system followed the path of least resistance. Credit flowed toward confidence. Ownership followed visibility. And silence was interpreted as consent. For a long time, I believed that if I just kept my head down, the system would eventually do the right thing. But systems don't have morals. They have momentum, and momentum follows patterns, not intentions. The most important lesson I learned is this. If you don't define your role, someone else will, and they'll define it in a way that serves them. Quiet strength is powerful, but only when it's paired with clear boundaries. Silence can be dignified, but only when it's chosen, not expected. And being underestimated is not a flaw unless you build your life around correcting other people's assumptions. I didn't win by confronting anyone. I didn't win by reclaiming what was taken. I won by refusing to continue participating in a structure that required my invisibility. That kind of win doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with peace. And peace, I've learned, is what arrives when your actions finally align with your self-respect. If you're listening to this and feeling unsettled, not angry, but thoughtful, I understand. These stories often resonate not because of what happens, but because of what they name quietly. Maybe you've been the one who holds everything together. Maybe your work runs smoothly, but your name rarely surfaces. Maybe you've told yourself it's fine, that it will balance out later. I won't tell you what to do. I'll only leave you with this question, one I wish I had asked myself sooner. Where in your life are you still being relied on, without being recognized? And what would change if you stopped compensating for that imbalance? If this story reflected something you've lived, I'd like to hear from you. Not the dramatic version, the quiet one, the one that doesn't always get told. Take care of yourself,